already a prime target of urgent attack more than a century and a half ago in the eyes of Marx and Engels. All these daring revisions, which are supposed to raise the striking novelty of the marginal and dissident masses up against totalitarian Marxism-Leninism, but you write, are word for word that which Marx and Engels in the German ideology had adhered to pieces around 1845 in order to clear the terrain for a finally coherent systematization of the revolutionary practices of that time. The primacy of politics, which in the Maoist formulation often receives the name of antagonism, in this figure of leftism thus becomes reduced to the postulate of a radical distance or exteriority with regard to an absolute understanding of society, capitalist as well as communism, as oppressive systems. As someone who more than as a philosopher self-identifies as a literary critic, I am particularly interested in the aesthetic form that such a mode of understanding takes today. In this regard, I would say that we are completely under the sway of a melodramatic mode of presentation, in the sense in which Althusser is what is perhaps his most astonishing and least outdated text in four Marx. I mean the piece on the materialist theater of Bertolacci and Brecht defines melodramatic consciousness as a false dialectic of good-bad consciousness. Jacques Rancière, who incidentally would turn this accusation back against his former teachers, proposes a similar reading of leftism's melodramatic contradiction in a review of André Glucksmann's La cuisinière et le mangeur d'hommes, The Cook and the Man-Eater. The whole book is an organized effect based on a purification of the contradiction. On one hand, power and the discourse of the master, philosophers, kings, Jacobins, Marxists, organized according to the rules of state constraint. On the other, the class of non-power, the plebs, pure generosity, whose discourse expresses the sole desire of not being oppressed. Such simple contradictions against the rest of the earth, against a fascistic state power, are nowhere to be found in the world. Nor can the plebs be defined purely as those excluded from power, or as pure non-power. As Rancière writes, nowhere the conflict of power and non-power plays itself out. Everywhere the state stumbles upon, not the plebs, but classes, corporations, collectives, and their rules, their forms of recognition and democracy, but also of exclusion and even oppression. Rancière draws an important lesson from this reading of leftism, which brings us back to the unfinished work of Marx. Lesson perhaps of this confrontation, that there is never any pure discourse of authoritarian power, nor any pure discourse of its non-power. The force of Marx's thought, but perhaps also its untenable character, resides no doubt in the effort to hold these contradictions, finir, antenable, an untenable attempt to hold on to these contradictions, which since then have been stripped bare into the police fictions of proletarian powers or the pastoral dreams of plebeian non-power. I've argued elsewhere that I think Rancière in Disagreement himself falls into the trap of this opposition, with the notion of politics versus police. In other words, instead of purifying the contradiction into a strict exteriority, the task would consist in finding the point of articulation where power and resistance, or power and non-power, are tied together into a single knot. This brings me to the second great figure of contemporary leftism, the main source of which lies precisely in a principle of immanence between power and resistance. Instead of postulating the idea of a radical break, in other words, this second figure proposes to follow the outline of the virtuality of communism within capitalism. We might even say that instead of, or rather against the corrupt forms of really existing communism, this figure traces the contours of a virtually existing communism. The second figure, too, can present solid orthodox credentials. Aside from the famous passages in the Communist Manifesto, quoted by Michael before, where Marx and Engels describe how the development of mother industry cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces an appropriate product, so that what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers, I am thinking of one of the letters in Marx's truly breathtaking correspondence with Bruno, which shows how the conditions for the new society are already present within the old one. The reform of consciousness consists only in making the world aware of its own consciousness, in awakening it out of its dream about itself, in explaining to it the meaning of its own actions. Marx writes to his young Hegelian friend, "It will then become evident that the world has long dreamt of possessing something of which it has only to be conscious in order to possess it in reality. It will become evident that it is not a question of drawing a great mental dividing line between past and future, but of realizing the thought of the past. Lastly, it will become evident that mankind is not beginning a new work, but is consciously carrying into effect its old work." The image of time here no longer corresponds to the theological notion of the break, but that of a fold or a wrinkle. It is not a matter of skipping ahead, but of seizing the new work into the old. Not to break the history of mankind in two halves, according to Nietzsche-style grand thought, but rather to track down the latent counter-finality in the existing state of things, in order to awaken and empower their potential for resistance, subversion, and destruction. In fact, after the purification of antagonism, based on the principle according to which one divides into two, we can see that immanence, as its philosophical source of a second form of left-wing communism, ironically finds support in another Maoist principle, namely the one according to which, where there is oppression, there is rebellion. To be more precise, rebellion in this orientation is ontologically prior to oppression. Such is the mode of reasoning that we can find in different guides, from Michel Foucault to Gilles Deleuze to Tony Napier. Even Glucksmann, who is never far behind when it comes to stepping on the shadow of genuine emancipatory thinkers, makes this principle his own when in La Cuisinière et le Mangeur d'Hommes he posits, "In the beginning there was resistance." From this ontological primacy of resistance, however, the attention of the new philosopher quickly turns yet again to the overwhelming power of repression displayed by the awe-inspiring state. In sum, a certain leftist and ex-Maoist renegacy, on the one hand, regurgitates the melodrama of the world broken in two. This is not one divided into two, so much as 2 times 1, based upon a principle of exteriority and dissidence. On the other hand, we find a left-wing communism based on the imminent reversibility of power and resistance, of capital and communism, or even of empire and multitude, as 2 sides of one and the same flippable coin. In this case, there is no more outside, but neither is there the protective safe haven of a pre-constituted inside, since both outside and inside are nothing but the illusory extremes of a dialectic that is now completely obsolete, except in the form of nostalgic and melodramatic regression. Another world, then, is possible without ever having to rely on an idealist Hindenwelt or world behind the world. 3. The current situation and our path for communism in Cochabamba. Where then do we stand today with regard to the struggle between left-wing communism and the ABC of Marxism? I would say that everything indicates that in an era marked by the crisis of capitalist parliamentarism and of the party form of politics in general, all that is left in the eyes of our most radical contemporary thinkers is the unlimited and spontaneous affirmative energy of pure communism, purged of all this historically compromising ties that once invoked the now infamous names of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, or Mao. As late as in 1982, in his theory of the subject, Badiou still included communism among what he called, in a playful allusion to one of Lacan's seminars, the 4 fundamental concepts of Marxism, together with class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and revolution. What happens then when one of these four fundamental ideas, only that of communism, is retained, moreover raised to the status of a Platonic or Kantian idea? Can we still legitimately tie such an idea of communism to the history of Marxism as politics? And more generally, even if we consider as closed the sequence in which politics could historically be referred to in Marxism, what are we to make of Bosteels' recent call for the complete separation of the communist hypothesis both from the party form and from the figure of the state? With regard to the question of communism and the state, Bosteels writes, in often obscure disasters, at the level of subjectivity, the concrete history of communism does not rely upon the paradisiacal state, which serves only as a random objectification. And then he adds, there is a hypothesis which is both stronger and simpler. It is that the political and thus subjective history of communism is essentially divided from their state history. And regarding the Leninist party, Bosteels concludes his text on the communist hypothesis from the little book on Sarkozy, which actually repeats the periodization that can already be found, sometimes verbatim, in Theory of the Subject. And I quote, "The party has been an appropriate tool for the overthrow of weakened reactionary regimes, but it proved ill-adapted for the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the sense that Marx had intended, that is, a temporary state organizing the transition to the non-state, its dialectical withering away, with the result that the last historical realization of the communist hypothesis at the end of the sequence between 1917 and 1976 ended up by targeting the party form itself. Quote, the last great convulsion of the second sequence, the Cultural Revolution in May 68 in its broadest sense, can be understood as an attempt to deal with the inadequacy of the party. What are we to make of a communist hypothesis from which all the traditional mediating terms have been subtracted or punched out so as to leave in place only the autonomous action of the masses as the effectuation of the communist invariant, that is, ideological elements of anti-property, anti-authority, and anti-hierarchy, as defined originally in 1976 by Badiou and François Balmet in Off Ideology, but always at a distance from the state? Are we not back here in the scheme of left-wing communism? Of course, in this age of terror and crisis, or of crisis as terror, leftism always offers an attractive, ethical, moral high ground. In fact, the appeal of the leftist hypothesis might very well be directly proportionate to the rise of a global turn to the right, with only a few exceptions worldwide, particularly in Latin America. It would explain the contemporary resurgence of various forms of speculative leftism in so-called radical philosophy. In a situation of rampant conservatism and blunt reactionary politics, especially in Europe, but also in the USA, where Obama faces an impossible legacy of pillaging on an unprecedented scale of nihilism and destruction under the Bush years, when new forms of political organization are either lacking or insufficiently articulated, the most tempting posture is indeed one of radical left-wing idealism or adventure. Leftism, in other words, appears today as the beautiful soul of communism. Except, I would add, that without this soul, the communist idea is perhaps little more than the empty shell of a body, if not a soothingly embalmed and mummified corpse. Conversely, whenever the question of organization is raised, the old specters of Leninism, of iron discipline, and the critique of trade unionism or reformism inevitably raise their ugly heads yet again. In this sense, I know that many of you will argue that we start on the wrong foot by taking as our point of departure Lenin's pamphlet on left-wing communism, with its stifling impact between social movements and organizations, or between anarchism and the state. In my final comments, however, I would like to put to the test some of the presuppositions behind this alleged impact by turning to another major communist thinker of our time, namely Evo Morales' running mate and the current Bolivian Vice President, Álvaro García Linera, author not only of two important books on Marx and Marxism, written while in prison during the 1990s on charges of subversive activities, but also of a fundamental collection of his sociological writings, published just a few months ago in Argentina.